Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it's my great honor to welcome you here today at this conference titled The Men Who Unlocked the Voices of Ancient Artists, 100th Anniversary of Professor Czerny's first visit to Egypt. We are gathering here today at the culmination of this year's activities related to Professor Jaroslav Černý, and today we celebrate not only Professor Černy's remarkable contribution to Egyptology, but also his extraordinary gift for connecting people. Throughout his life, he created lasting ties across countries and cultures, bringing together scholars, students, and friends from different and sometimes divided parts of the world. And this ability to unite people is, in my opinion, a legacy worthy of commemoration today, reminding us of the timeless value of dialogue, understanding, and cooperation. Before I give a floor to our speakers, let me express our deep gratitude to the French Institute of Oriental Archaeology in Cairo for hosting this event and for joining us as a valued partner in celebrating this important anniversary. So the level of cooperation reflects the very spirit of openness and international exchange Professor Černý himself embodied. So without further ado, I would like to invite to the floor Director of French Institute of Oriental Archaeology, Professor Pierre Tallet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Your Excellency, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and pleasure for me to open this day dedicated to the memory of Jaroslav Černý, one of the most renowned Egyptologists of this generation and one of the researchers that was most closely associated with our French Institute of Oriental Archaeology during the major part of his career. Born in 1898, he was a student of Franciszek Lexa, one of the pioneers of Egyptology and the founder of Czech Egyptology. But it was as a Ifao that Černý made his first steps into the field at the site of Deir el-Medina, where Ifao teams were beginning to excavate. From 1925 onwards, with the agreement of Georges Foucard, the then director of the Ifao, Jaroslav Černý became one of the main collaborators of Bernard Bruyère in the excavation and exploration of the village of the craftsmen that were building the royal tombs of the King's Valley in Luxor, which, in some 30 years of exploration, yielded thousands of hieratic ostraca of various kinds, documenting all aspects of the daily lives of these workers. The search of Jaroslav Černý for the memory of the ancient inhabitant of Luxor was relentless, combining the reading of hieratic ostraca, of which he was one of the greatest specialists, with exploration in the Theban mountains in search of graffiti carved into the rock, often left by the scribes of the ancient Egypt in the shadiest corners of this rocky landscape. He also edited hieratic papyri from the sites and had planned to publish 3 large volumes on the workers of Deir el-Medina, a project that was unfortunately interrupted by his death. Only the first volume, a community of workmen at Thebes in the Ramesside period, as well as a small part of the second volume, Valley of the King, were finally published in 1973. I didn't have the opportunity, unlike Professor Fayza Haykal, who will tell us more about this later, to meet Professor Jaroslav Černý. I was only 4 years old when he died in 1970. However, I have encountered him very often throughout my career, through his notes and publication, having worked myself on the ostraca of Deir el-Medina, JR labels, and benefited from numerous transcriptions he made in the field when these texts were discovered. I also benefited greatly from his work on a lesser-known aspect of his fieldwork, the pharaonic turquoise and copper mines of Sinai. Jaroslav Černý had indeed been a member of the Harvard University expedition to the site of Serabit el-Khadim in Sinai, and he spent a month there in mission from the 29th March to the 26th April 1935, which enabled him to completely rework the dossier of the inscription of Sinai, the first edition of which has been produced in 1917 by Hermann Herbert Gardiner and Thomas Eric Pitt, based on the notes and documentation gathered by Flinders Petrie during his 1905 campaign in Sinai. All the readings were reviewed, new facsimile were produced, and the corpus was expanded by more than 100 additional texts. Having worked myself on Serabit el-Khadim plateau in sometimes difficult conditions, I remain in awe of Jaroslav Černý's efficiency in accomplishing such a colossal task in such a short time. The result was monumental. A new edition of all these monuments, published between 1952 and 1955, accompanied by translation, commentaries, and indexes, which even today, 60 years later, form the basis of all studies on the Sinai Peninsula in the Pharaonic era. I'm delighted that the entire Egyptological community is today paying tribute to this great scholar in the institution that was his home through his career. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Director. And now please join me in welcoming to the floor Ambassador of the Czech Republic, His Excellency Mr. Ivan Jukl, to deliver his opening remarks as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, Dr. Fayza. You know, I'm the only one here who actually doesn't know as much as the other speakers about Professor Černý. So I'm not going to surprise you with details of his life, of the contribution in Egyptology. But as the co-host of the event, I'd like to stress why it's so important to talk about him today. Of course, we are celebrating 100 years of his first visit to Egypt. But before I start, of course, merci beaucoup, cher Pierre, pour avoir nous ici. I'm very happy that really Ifao did a great effort and we can actually enjoy the event in these premises. Professor Černý was a person who was probably more famous abroad and got more recognition than in his own country. And actually, if I had to write, or if I have to write a paper on him, I would call it something like Černý, professor or diplomat by spirit and profession, because he was actually both scientist and diplomat, which actually many people don't know during the Second World War. But as Lucy said, actually, one thing that we should remember is that he was able to connect people. His life, you know, his notes was like chronicle of the expeditions to Deir el-Medina and other places in Egypt, because he, in my view, sorry if I exaggerate a bit, he was like Czech Champollion. He was really able to read different kinds of letters. Even he wrote a grammar on a Coptic language. So he was the one who was attracting attention from other expeditions. But as has been already said, he was connecting people. Let's not forget that actually he was born in old good Austro-Hungarian Empire. So he was not like truly born Czechoslovak. He was growing in the environment where actually was very favorable to the contacts to Egypt. If you go to Ataba Square, you will find actually a tearing house which was built by the Czech architect for Austrian owner in 1911. So the interest in all empire, of course, was to be, you know, spilled over to newborn Czechoslovakia, which with the help of Professor Lexa and later Professor Černý managed. Well, of course, one of the greatest achievements of Professor Černý, which has actually never been appreciated at the time when I was at school, was that after his death, we got all his know-how. He stored in Oxford Library, in his own library, and Charles University greatly benefited of it. So he was not connecting Austrian Empire with democratic Czechoslovakia. He was also connecting communist Czechoslovakia with actually modern times. So this is why actually we should pay tribute to someone who was so modest that he was buying Ostrakaz from his own budget, and that's why I always talk about Professor Černý, about a hidden hero of the Czech Republic, and now you perhaps understand more why I'm saying it. Of course, the times where he was living were very difficult. As Albert Einstein put it, it was easier to split an atom than to destroy the prejudices. But I think that his example of modest work, of permanent engagement, actually he died on his way to his office in Oxford, I think are very good examples, not only for us who are actually representing institutions, but also for young people when they decide about their further career. So this is something I hope we can all remember whenever we bump into the name of Professor Černý. Thank you very much again for coming here, and I hope that now is the best time for you to discover all the details of his remarkable life from the mouths of our following speakers. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Ambassador, for driving our attention to also diplomatic aspect of Černy's life. And I believe now it's time to introduce our outstanding speakers. Each of them is bringing a unique expertise and experience that will help us to explore aspects of life of Professor Jaroslav Černý. First one being Professor Fayza Haykal, Professor Emerita from American University in Cairo, followed by Dr. Hana Navrátilová, Fellow and Director of Studies in Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Harris Manchester College at the University of Oxford, and also a brilliant mind behind this idea of this conference, followed by Dr. Daniela Rosenow, Manager of the Griffith Institute at the University of Oxford, and finally Professor Kathrin Gabler, who is a Chair in Egyptology at Johannes Gutenberg University, Mainz. So I hope you are going to have wonderful time. Please, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to make their notes. And for those who are watching us online, feel free to write them down in the comments. We will make sure to read them out loud when the discussion starts after the lectures. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. I am very happy to be part of this commemoration of Professor Černý because he was my professor. I am very proud of that, and because I was his last student. Again, this was a good luck for me because I learned a lot from him. I was there with him for 3 years in Oxford, and we used to see each other very, very frequently, of course. So this is why I called him a pillar of Egyptology, of modern Egyptology. I want to say that Czerny's collaboration with the Ifao also constituted a major move in his individual Egyptological career. First, it opened perspectives of teamwork with Egyptian and international Egyptology. Secondly, it focused an important part of this contribution on late Egyptian language. He wrote a very important book on late Egyptian language and also on the scripts, on the hieratic and how he deciphered it. And I don't want to repeat what has been said before. Among his very important contribution was his selection of Abu Sir to become the أنا أسهل لي كده. Okay, شكرا. So I want to tell how many things he did which were his doings. For example, the fact that Abu Sir now is entirely worked and excavated and published by the Czech is thanks to him, because he told them he is the one who chose Abu Sir to be the center for Czech work in Egyptology in Egypt. Among the very important thing I want to say is his role in maintaining Egyptology in Prague during the war and after the war. During the war, Czerny, as was mentioned before, lived in a period he was born in 1988 and he died in 1970. That is to say that he was present on the scene in a particular period which was either communist or war period. So at a certain point, he could not go back to Czech Republic because it was behind the war and he was cut away from his own country. However, he managed not to be really cut away because he kept sending information on Egyptology, international Egyptology, to his country via letters. So if somebody works on his letters, we can see how much he has contributed to send books and letters and information to his university in Prague while he could not go there himself. And then, in addition to this, his international Egyptology was very important because he worked in many places. Firstly, he began here at the French Institute, and then he worked in different places. But it was a very bohemian way of living with no really security, because every time he had to depend on being financed sometimes from his own country, but very often from other people in the international community. Czerny spoke all languages you can think of, all European languages. And he worked with his languages in the Torino Museum. He worked in, of course, Cairo, and he worked in Paris. He worked everywhere because he had this facility of contacting his colleagues who always admired him because of his very, very vast knowledge. And therefore, that is part of the linking between people that we have heard before, and also of the courage he had to live this kind of very difficult life. After the war was finished, he still could not really easily go there, but he protected the Egyptology program in Prague to disappear. Because at some point he became professor in London, and then he became the professor of Oxford. And when he was professor of Oxford, Jaromír Málek wanted to go to England, so he helped coming to England, and he became the famous archive holder and keeper of the Griffith Institute. However, when Werner asked him to do the same thing, he wanted also to quit because life was very difficult in Prague in those days. He told him, if you leave Prague, the whole Institute of Egyptology in Prague will disappear. So I recommend you that you stay there and protect it, because it's important for us to have a link with Egypt and to study Egyptology in Abu Sir. So that was a very, very important move, of course, he made. And I think that was one of the most important things that was done for Czech Egyptology, in addition to what he was doing for all the others. So I don't want, because you have heard before me other speakers who spoke very much about Czerny, so I shall be brief and stop at that so that we have a chance to discuss it later on more. And this is just an introduction of the very, very many services Czerny did to Egypt, how he wrote his books. But I am talking about the man, not about the books now, because someone else is going to. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that you will enjoy the rest of the evening.
Good evening, Your Excellency, Monsieur le Directeur, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure and a privilege to be here, and as Czerny's biographer, or rather one of his biographers, I really, in a way, oughtn't to be here, because it should be the evening of those who knew him, and we just had Professor Fayza Haykal remembering him, and also those who work in Deir el-Medina, and we will have that later on. But in some ways, and I'm trying to make sure we can actually share the presentation. Yes, there we are. In some ways, however, the evening wouldn't be complete without Oxford, I dare to say. So you will hear much more about the wonders of the Griffith Institute archive from a colleague and a friend, Daniela, and you will hear much more about Deir el-Medina from a colleague and a friend, Kathrin, later on. My task should be to go in the footsteps, to tell you some stories, and also to tie together what you have already heard about Czerny tonight, and what are you going to hear even in more detail. And there are many aspects of his life, and for a historian, for somebody who is both an Egyptologist and a historian of the modern 19th and 20th century, which is what I am, it is a big responsibility, because you're seeing a story of somebody who had a huge impact on his discipline, an international, transnational impact. But you're also thinking we have to reflect on our own stories, on our own way, how we do Egyptology. What contingencies was Czerny contending with? What contingencies do we contend with? Because very often our own stories make us look for the stories in the past. And at the same time, we want to hear really about him. What was it? How was it like to be an Egyptologist on his way throughout the 20th century? So if we go from the beginning, 1898 to 1970, you see a story that transcends 2 centuries, that transcends changing empires that disintegrate. New states grow, states change from kingdoms to republics, sometimes the other way around. It's very much impossible to not be emotional about modern history. And some stories from the 20th century we read in different ways. There are many passports in this room. Some of us have more than one in their pocket. And we see all of these stories of nations and countries, and we're fascinated by the diversity, but we are also sad because of all the pain that the 20th century brought to so many people. And sometimes we tell a different story about the same moment in history. Perhaps the important point then is to keep the dialogue going. So where does Egyptology and a life story of one Egyptologist fit into this? You've already heard that Czerny lived through difficult times. He was born in Austria-Hungary in a multinational empire. He benefited from the multilingual education this country provided. But he wasn't from a privileged family. He had to build up his career. He didn't start working as an academic. He studied classical philology and, as they were then called, Oriental studies in Prague. He started building his international network very soon, being fascinated by the economic and social life in antiquity. And as you will also see in more detail, his research trajectory started with not being a philologist actually, but being a historian, deeply interested in the life of the ancient communities in Egypt. He first didn't know that the workmen and craftsmen he kept reading about in New Kingdom texts were living in Deir el-Medina. When he started being fascinated by them in 1921, Bernard Bruyère was just restarting the work of the French Institute, our generous hosts, in the site, and they went on separate trajectories by then. So Czerny worked as a clerk in a bank, and he built his network with Italian, French, and British Egyptologists throughout the early 1920s. He became, because of a generous support by the first Czechoslovak president, Thomas Garrick Masaryk, the attachée étranger at this institution in 1925, his first time in Egypt. And the rest is history, you could say. He was the Czechoslovak diplomat during the Second World War, and you've already heard that he became then the Edwards Professor of Egyptology in London and finished his life as a Professor of Egyptology and then Emeritus Professor in Oxford. But it is not the whole story. His is a story of a big change from a historian to a philologist to a historian again. His is also a story of a man losing his citizenship, yet maintaining the links to his country of origin and building new links in France, in Egypt, and in the UK. Not to mention that he then traveled on a UNESCO passport in the 50s and 60s, working for the Centre de Documentation in Cairo, a major institution documenting Egyptian monuments in the 1950s, Egypt and onwards, and then for UNESCO in the times of the campaign. When I had to work on his biography in steps, it was a lot of air miles spent. Don't read this, it's just to give you the feeling for the sheer amount of archive material in several continents, which also gives you a sense of how many people I'm grateful for and how many institutions were crucial to the project of his biography. And so it went from heaps and reams and folders of archive documents carefully curated at the Griffith Institute, at the Ifao, and at the Czech Institute of Egyptology and many others. There then came the book. It took 7 years, and you could say that was the biblical 7 years labor, but I was grateful in many ways for that opportunity. But writing a biography doesn't mean that you only write a story of one person. You also write about their intellectual development. You also write about their network, if you like sociology and you've heard about Bruno Latour, this is how you could do a diagram of actor network theory. And that's exactly what Czerny was, connecting between different places and also working, as you will see in more detail later on, with all the artifacts and texts he could get his hands on from the site of Western Thebes in Upper Egypt and later from Deir el-Medina. So when you shape a biography of somebody like that, you look at the chronology of their life, but you also can't avoid the context of modern history. And we've already heard about how he was overcoming the limitations put in his way by the First and Second World War and the Cold War later on. But there were also opportunities such as the decolonization of Egyptology in Egypt. He became also part of many teams. He became part of the team of the Ifao from the 1925, financed by Czechoslovak diplomacy, but also developing his contribution to French and international and Egyptian Egyptology. He then became part of the big private project funded by Ellen Henderson Gardiner from 1934 onwards. And then with the interlude during the Second World War, 1942 to 45, when he was a diplomat, first in Cairo and then in London, working for the Czechoslovak government in exile, he continued Egyptology alongside. He first paid proper attention to the site of Abu Sir during the Second World War. It was kind of a replacement project for Deir el-Medina. So mapping that life was putting together a puzzle of correspondence, the history of other individuals, of institutions and projects, and also intellectual concepts in Egyptology. How do we study the life of ancient Egyptians that Czerny had to put together? But let's start with something of a personal aspect in this brief foray into his biography. In 1925, he arrived as a young scholar, and he wrote back not only to his sponsor, the Czechoslovak president, he wrote not only to his colleagues, such as Ellen Gardiner and Thomas Eric Peat from the UK, but of course he also wrote to his parents. And this is the sort of thing a young Egyptologist, 27-year-old, writes to his parents. He draws a plan of the a part of the expedition house in Deir el-Medina, the expedition house of the Ifao, and you can see that he mentions where his room was, where Bernard Brière was staying, and where there was a kitchen and a pot with plants. And of course, to his mum, he had to say what is it that he was eating. And I'm not entirely sure you can read it at the distance, but he said that for breakfast they had fried eggs, 2 cups of tea with lemon, hot chocolate on Sunday so that we know it's a Sunday, French bread, which I like, jam, orange, strawberry, cherry, or apricot, and I like them so much. As somebody who is also British, I have to say orange is not a jam, it's a marmalade, but we can forgive Czerny for saying that. So he was keen on everyday detail. Now, this is what he wrote to his parents, but he also wrote about the life of Egyptian workmen in the house, and he also mentioned that at that time the Ifao mission was employing both young Egyptian men and women. So when you look at a biography, you actually can move on and start mapping a whole, as we call it in sociology of research, epistemic community. Now that's a big name. What does it mean? It essentially means looking at the discipline of Egyptology as a global intellectual project anchored in Egypt that is building up cultures of knowledge, that is trying to figure out what it wants to do and how to do it, that exchanges knowledge with other disciplines in social sciences and humanities, and it also reflects on its history, which is what we are doing also tonight. And when you look at the life of Czerny, how he changed, you can also see how he changed his research targets from somebody who in his unpublished work was very much looking into the social life. The drawing of the landscape in Western Thebes shows how he was focused on where the Egyptians might have lived. And then on he went to collect the texts. Collecting texts went from objects, so monumental texts in tombs, statues, stelae, to the texts on ostraca, hieratic material. And then he went into this whole analysis of language, hieratic script, but later on presenting other sources about Egyptian history. Sometimes he made a detour, like for example the publication on ancient Egyptian religion, where he said, I'm just giving you the sources, I can't interpret this. So he's mostly remembered for a prolific publications output as a philologist, but that is only part of the story. And you can see also, if you look at this graph, that there is a sharp uptick after his death, because he left so much that had to be published, and there is still something that waits to be published up until now. And the Griffith Institute Archive is doing a big job on that regard. He was a prolific networker. This is a photo from the 1930s Czechoslovak legation, not yet embassy, in Cairo, and he's in black tie in the top row. And you can see that he was building his context in Czechoslovakia, a state with great aspirations to become a part of the democratic world. Not an ideal state, as the 20th century history had or has also shown. But it was the ethos, the aspirations of the Masarykian Czechoslovakia that Černý was a part of. It was also, of course, a privilege that he was thus supported and could develop his research trajectory, as I said, starting with the social and economic history that he wanted to portray, social and economic history of ancient Egypt, he wanted to portray in his 1922 dissertation, abandoning this overly ambitious project to focus on the text studies, then realizing these fantastic opportunities coming my way, 1925, starting at the Ifao, and that shaped his subsequent career in text and philology work, but then, of course, coming back to epigraphic documentation in Egypt, and then trying to write all these projects focused on the community, the prosopography, and the lives of the workmen at Deir el-Medina. So there he is, as a team worker, because all of this, what he was doing, was very much a part of a team. So when we talk of him, it's not that we want to make him a saint or write his hagiography, but we recognize somebody who wasn't a gatekeeper. He was using his privilege to enable others, just as he was enabled by others. And he followed calls of other Egyptologists. For example, his interest in the workmen was supported by this great opportunity to join the Ifao in 1925. But earlier on, he read the works of Wilhelm Spiegelberg, for example, and that spurred him on looking into both monumental, non-monumental texts, from tombs to graffiti in Western Thebes. And when we think of him in his later years as embedded in the British academic establishment, his connections and his sociability did bind him there, but in a way he was very much a non-aligned person, somebody very open in the sense of working with colleagues from different countries. His correspondence is a great proof of that. Any attempt at outlining it hits a bit of a block, because we really only have the body of his correspondence fully from after 1946, what's preserved in the Griffith Institute archive. He couldn't take all his papers with him when he left Czechoslovakia for the UK. So there are various limitations that make our corpus a bit more condensed, but we can see the range of professional communication, and this is in a way a type of the iceberg, because then there is the communication that's personal and that wasn't deposited in the archive. His family may have decided not to do so. There may be lost correspondence, and moreover there are all these other things that we don't have, such as meetings in Egypt that obviously are not shown in here. Note the peaks in correspondence, the rebuilding of the Egyptological network after the Second World War, and then the big uptick in the 50s as the documentation projects in Egypt, the Centre de Documentation and then the UNESCO campaign, were taking off. So who is he? Somebody who navigated states, communities, and cultures. He was a migrant, if you want. He was between cultures. He was recognizing his limits when it came to knowledge, for example, of all the conditions of modern Egypt. He was interested, but he knew he was primarily an Egyptologist. He recognized the challenges, the mishaps, the opportunities of the relationship between European and Egyptian professionals. You can see that his network changed from a very sort of Eurocentric right in 1925 to also a network with a very significant Egyptian presence. And there is one photograph that I didn't manage to squeeze in that image, and that's of course Aziz Sadek, who was his eyes during the last big campaign that Černý led in Egypt, and that was the graffiti of the Theban mountain. So to conclude on this foray in his biography, he is an interesting case study for our research context and also ethics. He gives us the answer why to do Egyptology, because it's a fantastic, long-standing civilization which gives a great example of the dynamics of human societies, environmental adaptability, but it's also a discipline that lived through 200 years now of a very turbulent modern history. If you look at the chronological outline of his life, every single event of his life is matched by something happening in the world history. So we have journeyed through his professional development. We will visit Deir el-Medina in more detail, and we will also then go more into detail, looking into the treasure trove of the Griffith Institute archive, from where we have got quotes such as this, showing Czerny's deep interest in artifacts as well as in texts. And it is from there that we get an understanding of the breadth of interest that he had in supporting global projects in Egyptology, such as research infrastructures, bibliographies, big cooperative teams. And this is, in a way, also some ongoing effort here, because a lot of projects that you will hear more about in a second are also building on this legacy. So in that sense, I think this is the right moment to stop this bit of a biographical overview, concluding with a thanksgiving to our hosts and inviting my colleagues to give you an insight into Czerny's archive and also into Deir el-Medina. So with those words, handing over to Daniela and the Griffith Institute.
No.
Sorry. How do I actually get into? Yeah. I have to plan. Mazaher, good evening, Your Excellency, my dear colleagues and friends. First, I would like to thank the Czech Embassy for organizing and the Ifao for hosting this event in honor of Jaroslav Černý, who was, as we know now, the professor at Oxford for Egyptology between 1951 and 1965. And then subsequently, in his will, he bequeathed his academic records to the Griffith Institute. It is a real privilege for me to speak to you today as we celebrate the centenary of Czerny's first fieldwork in Egypt, particularly in Deir el-Medina. And so in my lecture, I will focus on the archival holdings of Czerny in the Griffith Institute archive. And this extraordinary collection spans decades of scholarly work and offers a rich insight not only into ancient Egypt, but also into Czerny's own intellectual legacy. The Czerny archive at the Griffith Institute is among the most comprehensive Egyptological collections anywhere. It occupies 12 shelves with more than 100 boxes, so we are roughly talking about 15 archival meters, and it is organized in 51 manuscript groups. What you see here is a selection of his material in the stacks, including some of the boxes with his slip index cards on the top right shelves. The manuscripts include thousands of transcriptions, translations, photographs, almost 200 notebooks that are filled with field transcription and notes, many with museum concordances, there are off-prints, there are lexicographic slips, and an extensive correspondence revealing the connections with over 300 scholars. In particular, Czerny's records on hieratic documents are highly significant for Egyptology, as they constitute a uniquely comprehensive and also meticulously transcribed corpus of original texts from ancient Egypt, especially those related to administration, law, and daily life in Deir el-Medina in the late New Kingdom. It is, of course, impossible for me tonight to even give you a rough overview of the material held in the Griffith archive, so allow me to show you highlights of some of the most significant groups. One of Czerny's most ambitious undertakings was a comprehensive dictionary of late Egyptian, on which he worked from the 1930s through to the 1960s. His aim was not simply to list words, but to build a systematic lexical corpus that captured meanings, usage contexts, and cultural associations. While he did not live to publish a full dictionary in his lifetime, his work laid the foundation for much of what we know now about late Egyptian grammar and vocabulary. Czerny's lexicographic material is housed across several manuscript groups in the Griffith Institute. What you see here are some of his notes towards the publication of the lexicographic material. And then there are also multiple slip collections containing thousands of handwritten slips with translations, proposed translations, occurrences in context, references to ostraca, papyri, other published texts, and occasionally etymological speculations and comparative Semitic parallels. What you see here are the slips for the late Egyptian dictionary, and here some slips in the boxes for his late Egyptian grammar. These slips are meticulously organized by topic and root. There are also sets dedicated to etymology, geographical names, and religious vocabulary. These records are not only philological tools, but also testament to Czerny's incredible discipline and his attention to linguistic precision, and Egyptologists still consult the material today to verify readings, to track textual variants, and contextualize rare terms, especially on unpublished ostraca. Czerny's name is probably most closely linked to el-Medina, the village of tomb artisans who worked on the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, and Czerny's connection to el-Medina was lifelong. From 1925 onwards, he returned nearly every year until the early 1950s, conducting meticulous documentation of tombs, of chapels, of stela and private houses. His fieldwork translations and analysis transformed our understanding of this community, and I'm already very much looking forward to Kathrin's lecture that is to come. At el-Medina, he worked closely with Bernard Brière, the head of the French excavation, and often with Alexandre Varil, sharing both fieldwork and publication processes and plans. He also built relationships with local workers, enabling him to gather oral traditions and practical knowledge that supplemented the textual records. The archive contains hundreds of inscriptions and photographs from tombs, from chapels, stela, and workmen's huts. There are notes on graffiti, there are field sketches, translations, there are preparations and drafts for lectures. There are plans. What you see here are two unidentified drawings of tombs in el-Medina. And among Czerny's el-Medina material, you can also find detailed studies of individual artisans and scribes, including various notes on the genealogies of the el-Medina workmen. And again, two boxes with slips entirely dedicated to the workmen of el-Medina, or the workmen in the place of the truth, with categories such as sources, work, revenues, women and families, oracles, and illness and death. Czerny's notebooks include drawings of tomb scenes, graffitis that he copied in situ, and commentary on stylistic features. These notes often cross-reference museum holdings, as Czerny visited museums with major collections of hieratic material from el-Medina, most notably the Museo Egizio in Turin, the British Museum in London, the Egyptian Museum in Berlin, and the Rijksmuseum in Leiden. The example you see here shows objects in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Here, copies of inscriptions on objects in the collection of the Louvre. And of course, there's a box with slips, giving the concordance of objects in museums and private collections with Czerny's notebooks. Czerny's transcriptions, especially of the hieratic ostraca and papyri, are a vital primary source for reconstructing the social, also the economic, and the political history of the ancient Egyptian workforce and community. His records continue to serve as a foundational reference for current research into this remarkable village and its people. These documents clearly show that Czerny approached el-Medina not just an archaeologist or a linguist, but as someone who wanted to reconstruct the human stories behind the texts. His notes are not just data, they reflect his wonder, his curiosity, and his care. Czerny's notebooks are probably the most heavily consulted group in our archive, also looking beyond the texts from el-Medina. There are altogether 180 notebooks housed in 17 boxes. These notes span several decades of work, including material from Czerny's fieldwork in Egypt, his museum visits across Europe and Egypt, with notes on provenance, museum concordances and object numbers, or his lexicographic work with observations on grammar and orthography. What you see here are hand copies of texts that Czerny made at the Sherabit el-Khadim. We've already heard about it today, with the Harvard expedition in 1935. The notebooks contain transcriptions of hieratic texts from Ostraka, papyri, and other objects, as well as transcriptions of graffiti, both in hieratic and in hieroglyphs, and hieroglyphic texts from monuments. Written in ink and pencil, they are structured with a clear division between object description, text, translations, and comments. Czerny often copied these in situ at sites or in museums. And to give you just a few examples, notes for sites in Egypt include the Memphite necropolis, Theban tombs and temples, Abydos, Kom-Ombo, Tanis, Beni Hassan, Abu Simbel, Casa Ibrahim, and Es-Sibua. The two examples you see here are from the Osirion at Abydos and graffitis from the Wadi Gebanat al-Gurud, southwest of the Valley of the Kings. Objects recorded in collections include artifacts from Cairo, Paris, London, Oxford, Edinburgh, Turin, Florence, Bologna, Naples, the Vatican, Berlin, Leipzig, Brussels, Leiden, Vienna, New York, and Philadelphia, as well as Russian collections. What you see here is the copy of an Ostrakon in the Egyptian Museum Georg Steindorf at Leipzig. And to show you one last example, these are the copies of texts on the Pyramidion of Turabi in the Kutorga collection in Petrograd, as it was called back then, nowadays, of course, St. Petersburg. These notebooks reflect Czerny's expertise and the breadth of content, including administrative documents, literary texts, and records crucial for understanding scribal practices, state organization, and prosopography. As we already heard today, Czerny was, of course, not working in isolation, and what truly stands out is his commitment to transnational Egyptology. The Griffith Institute Czerny archive contains over 2,500 letters exchanged with more than 300 correspondents worldwide. Even in the politically dense periods after the Second World War, Czerny maintained contacts with scholars in Germany, in Italy, and Egypt, keeping research networks active when official channels were very often quite strained. The archive includes rich correspondence with figures as Alan Gardiner, Alexandre Varil, Jean Capart, Baptiste Comgan, and Etienne Trioton. What you see here is a letter written by Alan Gardiner that is addressed to Dear Jaro and signed off with yours ever. The letters often include academic discussions, for instance, over readings of hieratic texts, feedback on translations, updates on excavation progress and finds, requests for help to trace the provenance of artifacts, but also personal notes on health, on family, on his travels. His letters show how ideas were exchanged very generously, in a collaboration rather than a competitive spirit, and the archive testifies to unity in the Egyptological community, with many correspondents thanking Czerny for providing references, for reading drafts, or helping them access archival material. The Czerny catalog is fully published on the Griffith Institute online catalog, and at least parts of the Czerny archive have been digitized, supporting research, and as his records combine textual, visual, and linguistic materials, the archive is a very powerful tool for cross-disciplinary research, philology, archaeology, religion, and social history. Czerny's records are today used for philological studies, in particular on the late Egyptian language. They are used in archaeological and site studies, as well as museum studies, particularly provenance research and identifying, dating, and contextualizing ostraka, papyri, and other inscribed objects held in museum collections. His correspondence is used to reconstruct intellectual networks of 20th century Egyptology and supports bibliographical studies. Parts of them are also parts of digital projects integrated into online corpora, like the Deir el-Medina database, or the soon-to-be or already live graffiti gazetteer. And his notebooks are also a vital teaching tool. Egyptology students at Oxford use Czerny's notebooks and photographs to learn epigraphical techniques and late Egyptian. I would like to finish my lecture by showing you one of the most moving items that I have encountered during my work in the Griffith Institute, or perhaps in my entire Egyptological life working with archives. This is one of Czerny's final pairs of reading glasses that was donated to the Griffith Institute by Czerny's stepdaughters. For me, this is a quiet but a very powerful artifact that bridges the scholarly and the personal. It reminds us of the lived life behind the archive. So to conclude, the Czerny archive represents rigorous research, international collaboration, and generous scholarship. It is not only a memorial to a brilliant mind, but a living tool for Egyptologists today. So as we celebrate the 100th anniversary of his first trip to Egypt, we honor not just what he recorded, but also how he worked and the legacy that he left behind. So I hope this overview gave you a sense of the archive scope and the value of the Czerny records and his immense legacy in Oxford. And perhaps my lecture has even inspired you to discover these records yourself on our online database. So thank you very much for your attention. And again, thank you very much to the organizers for this brilliant event.
Perfect. Good evening also from my side. I also would like to thank warmly the French Institute and the Embassy of the Czech Republic, in particular Pierre Tallet, the director of the French Institute, and His Excellency Ambassador Ivan Jukel for hosting this event tonight and inviting me, or actually giving me the honor of speaking on Czerny's legacy in el-Medina. I'm part of a big group of researchers of the modern el-Medina community, and 100 years after Jaroslav Černy's first visit to Egypt means also 100 years after his first fieldwork season in el-Medina. Since his PhD finished in 1922, so actually before coming to Egypt and el-Medina, and you see the photo here, which is very famous, and it's actually the last photo taken of Jaroslav Černý in el-Medina in 1970. Czerny's biggest interest was the community of workmen, as he referred to the site which accommodated the workers and their families who constructed the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings and Queens. El-Medina is a special case within Egyptology, a unique window into 3,000 years life ago, without comparison in the late Bronze Age in the entire Mediterranean. And actually, Jaroslav Černý is the founder of his own sub-field within Egyptology, the so-called el-Medina studies. He, and I also would like to add Bernard Bruyère, of course, for the archaeological site and responsible for the concession of the French Institute, set the ground and provided the basic for a branch of studies which has fruitfully spread in the past 100 years in various directions. And you can see, and you have heard, that he was famous, or is usually famously taken as a philologist, but his interests also included art history, material culture, archaeology, and also technical ideas you could use at the time 100 years ago. So my aim tonight is to address Czerny's legacy in el-Medina. We will focus on the impact of this great researcher and on perspective using Czerny's achievements as a starting point. When recommending a book today, it's still the community of workmen. But a book the author has never seen as a final product and printed volume, as many others of his manuscripts on the topics el-Medina, Late Egyptian, Hieratic Ostraka, and papyri. The founder of our subfield actually remained unaware of his huge impact and legacy. The community is until now not outdated, full of details and almost without mistakes. If there are, it's twisted inventory numbers or dates which were not adjusted due to rewriting processes or the posthum publication. However, he had planned long ago to publish a series of 3 volumes. This is the first. The second, we also have a manuscript on the Valley of the Kings, and the third never came to life. That you can deal with a lot of these manuscripts and basics he provided within seeing years of and spending decades of research, you can still investigate for younger colleagues. There's the one who made a master thesis out of chapter 20 of this book and a PhD of another one, chapter 26. And this is a photo of my personal copy. I bought this book in 2010 at the Ifao shop at the el-Medina, where you can still get the book being republished for the sake of contribution. And I also invite you, of course, to see the site and have a look at these contributions. The major book is certainly the biggest part of his legacy. But next to the identification of the village, which was not clear in these days what we are dealing with, so he made the famous gap and the article identifying the el-Medina as the workers' place, its purpose and function in the New Kingdom, he also set milestones on the social, economic, and micro-history within the Ramesside period and late Bronze Age Egypt in general, thanks to the many details provided from the site. The book builds up on his lifelong tremendous knowledge and collected details, as he has seen throughout collections all over the places and museums now accommodated at the Griffith Institute. From particular interest to Czerny were the administrative texts, written usually in hieratic, of which he made many first editions, setting certain standards on hieratic publications. And you see here a selection of books, either the Catalogue Général of the Cairo pieces or thousands of ostraca from the excavation of the Ifao, which are either stored there or in the archives here. His legacy counts also for hieratic studies, the cursive script of hieroglyphs, in particular ostraca from fieldwork, discovery to publication, but also for the late Egyptian grammar he came up with and the paleography linked to these notes. His work was included on many accounts, private transactions, necropolis journals, and letters, all giving us very special insights into a community he tried to reconstruct on a social basis. But facing a huge amount of newly excavated material on site, including the famous Gros Puits, on which he worked during field season, was not enough for him. He also tried to find and publish as many related texts distributed all over the world in different museums, but stemming from the el-Medina. And I show you here a couple of collections. Also, those copies are nowadays accommodated at the Griffith Institute. There's almost no collection which does not include at least one item or ostracon from the el-Medina, even if you also focused on other inscribed artifacts like stelae or statues and other materials to reconstruct his social history. His collected notes given to the Griffith Institute archive is really fulfilling its purpose there and still a central organ to access the site and unpublished materials, which is ongoing until now. The notebooks, of which I show you 2 copies here, one's ostraca and one's papyri, but remember the many details you saw by Daniela recently, are a central access presented in a very structured way. His notebooks are a kind of a prior digital database, if you want to call it this way, with many slips, indices, and notes. Nowadays, also partly digitally available, or thanks to the cooperating museums holding primary sources, for example, the Turin Museum, of which you see here some fragments, which was from his great interest, especially the papyri stemming from the el-Medina. But the notes are the basis for many important studies in the last 50 years on the el-Medina. Again, I show you only a selection. I could have added many more. Over the last 30 years, also digital initiatives have started replacing the printed publications, including shaping major databases. And some of these databases are hosted here at the French Institute. Others we have heard already in different databases like in Leiden or Munich on the textual data site. all of these digital media make our access much easier and smoothen the way for new research, where Czerny had to travel and see all these artifacts himself to collect the notes, which we are easily accessible nowadays with one click at the internet. Aspects, all of which Czerny prepared manually. Current projects involve many colleagues, including myself on the ongoing work on unpublished dossiers. In particular, the Turin papyri were from great interest, as there are several unique documents like the Strike Papyrus, the Royal Canon, or other famous documents stored in Turin. In the last years, we managed in a collaborative group between Basel, Liège, Leiden, and Turin to analyze those fragments digitally and publish them online, something Czerny could analyze on site but not achieve in those days. Today, we focus more on material features, find spots, scribal practice, and context. Contents Czerny was interested to reveal, respectively indicated many of such observations in his notebooks. So you have seen that besides the text and the hieroglyphs, you also have many comments on the material features, the script, or identification of the authors. The huge effort on the ongoing editions and interpretations show you how much new material Czerny faced when we are still not finished 100 years later. Born out of practical necessities, a division was made at that time, the division between administrative and literary texts. Czerny focusing further on the administrative material to reconstruct social history in el-Medina, and the literary fragments, plus I also include magical and medical texts here, written by the same scribes, draftsmen, and artisans, between him and Georges Posener. This led also to a disciplinary schism. Scholars moved to different institutions during their careers, where they developed their foci and trained students. And I use my own example coming from the administrative side in Munich and Leiden, and then bridging actually to the other one via Basel and Copenhagen. The administrative texts became an object or a different branch with centers like Leiden and Munich focusing on the economic, social, and political history of the village and related prosopographical issues, of which Czerny also is the founder. The literary texts were mostly used for their content, but also to resort additional witnesses for reconstructing the original literary composition, for example in Paris or Liège. While, not to miss, the archaeological and material culture part, the objects, sites, and monuments in their context have been ongoing investigated at the French Institute and the current mission in el-Medina, starting with Bernard Bruyère. I could mention here many more. So what we try is in this division, you can see also in the digital way. The division is mirrored in these online platforms nowadays with textual and bibliographical platforms on the one hand and material and archival databases on the other. And in the last years, we tried to overcome such boundaries again in projects like Crossing Boundaries, where we again take the same into consideration what Czerny did also with Georges Posener investigating the materials together. And we link now also in a multinational and multidisciplinary way. Of course, the modern el-Medina community knows many more aspects, which were investigated and published since Czerny passed away in 1970, using such digital advantages and methods. For several years, the Mission d'études et de conservation el-Medina, headed by Cédric Lachet, has grown into an international and interdisciplinary enterprise, combining many disciplines and universities. And thanks to this development, I think a globally acting Czerny, as we heard tonight in Hana's talk and the introduction, would have much appreciated our comprehensive approach he tried to use at his time but could never finish. Being an all-rounder within el-Medina studies, however, and using such a contextualized approach Jaroslav Černý had in mind, is a big challenge. What he tried to do is actually taking into consideration all objects, not only the hieratic texts, but also material culture, the information from the domestic sphere, like in houses and finds, working sphere, like the working sites in the Valley of the Kings, and reconstruct the building, the religious spheres from temples and chapels, and of course the funerary sphere, where he also copied texts in the tombs of the el-Medina. It allows us to reconstruct his probably major interest in reconstructing the history of the old inhabitants 3,000 years ago. So what I showcase here you with in the middle an old inhabitant, it's Ipui, the tomb owner of TD217. You can do with almost 2,000 individuals we identified by name in this village. And Czerny is the one who founded this kind of branch to investigate the life stories over 200 years, or if you take the entire New Kingdom, you go even up to 300 or 400. As a mission member, and I thank Cedric for a short overview, you see we are nowadays many people working on the site. And here, thanks to Czerny and reading his notebooks in Oxford many years ago, I learned you have to integrate as much material as possible to get the best analysis out of this community. So I bridged from prosopography and phallology to funerary archaeology with a reinvestigation of one of the tombs, but you can also see that we have groups working on specific monuments, restoration, temples, later using faces, and also, of course, the history of the site, as we do tonight. My particular contribution as a mission member is the reinvestigation of a tomb called TT217, that's the tomb of the sculptor Ipui, as you have seen before, on which also Czerny had a particular contribution. Of course, he knew the tomb, which was prior excavated to the Ifao activities on site, and he integrated the inscriptions into his repertoire onomastique. But he also used his tremendous knowledge already to see that the tomb itself has a very diachronic history between the different objects he could identify already at this time. You can see here the entrance hall, and you see on the very left side a foot facing outside and some white hieroglyphic lines, which are reproduced here in his published volume of the repertoire onomastique, but also the Ifao holds still an unpublished volume of the second part of the repertoire onomastique, which also starts again with TD217, where he revised his first readings on the door. But the interesting part is here, he used this tomb also to reconstruct then the family behind, and I cannot leave you today without a family tree, which are Czerny's greatest achievements for the site, to put all of these 2,000 names and inhabitants in order to create a family like this. And the reason why I'm showing you this one is actually he realized already in the 1950s that the specific branch, the white inscription on the door, is a link to the primary users of Ipui in this tomb. So the tomb was built in the first half of the reign of Ramses II, but the reused white inscription goes very late into the late 20th dynasty and actually identifies two tomb robbers mentioned in the tomb robbery papyri and a copy in Turin in the necropolis journals, which Czerny was aware that the tomb was reused over such a long period and people left their names on it. Ipui's microcosmos, as I show you here, also we use as a case study to develop a more modern access to the site. As I said, Czerny had this holistic approach in mind, in a diachronic perspective, source and context related, integrating as much material as possible, which is a challenge, even if we use the nowadays online databases. We try with the research space the el-Medina to combine such a holistic research and output, as well as many approaches and materials and their diverse sources. A vision Czerny had in mind, and now finally technology allows us to achieve. Around TD217, we also find nowadays physical traces of Jaroslav Černý in the el-Medina. 2 years ago, we could open a shaft in the courtyard of this very tomb again, which you can see here on the upper part of the slide. And while emptying the first part of this shaft, it was quickly clear it was used as a dump in the 1920s. And in this dump, we found also many modern materials, from using the French Institute's house probably as a popular meeting place, also for a break, because the tomb is located just next to the kitchen. In these materials, many matches, newspapers, notes, also list of former workmen, and letters were disposed in the half-empty shaft. The legacy from earlier researchers include letters written from Czerny to Briere, from Cairo to Luxor, prior to his arrival on site. So giving insights into the excavation of the French Institute 100 years ago, and also the time when Czerny first joined the mission. We even know the menu of the 15th of March 29. So you see, it was still important to talk about food, what Hana said from the first season, when Czerny was in the field. And if you need ideas for tomorrow's dinner, maybe I recommend also carotte du jardin or fruit et fromage for your dessert. The modern finds, the newspaper, the stamps, the matches, and the postmarks provide us with the terminus antiquem when the shaft was backfilled again in 1930 by Briere's team, and when then Czerny started doing the epigraphical work in the tomb. Czerny's legacy at el-Medina actually left many traces. Visible, as we can see, but also invisible. Physical, metaphorical, old, and also new finds. And a lot more can be added. My encouragement at the end would be to follow his suggestions, also given 100 years ago. And the impact, because he saw the material being excavated, the original find spots, he inventorized, and he pursued a lifelong el-Medina study with knowledge no one of us can achieve nowadays, even when I read all of his notebooks in Oxford. These photos in 1970, also here from the work in the Theban mountains, show his last stay in Egypt. 2 months later, he passed away in Oxford, but leading the way into the world of an ancient community, which gives us a rare glimpse behind the scenes 3,000 years ago. And today, the ancient and the modern community of workers, that's colleagues worldwide, and of course the mission itself, consists of many colleagues, preserving his knowledge and legacy and extending it for our Egyptological special case, and I'm sure with material and output for the next 100 years. Thanks.
We still have time for a discussion.
Exactly. So I would like to ask you if anyone has any question already. We will be running around with the microphone, so do not hesitate to raise your hand. And you do not have to limit yourselves to questions only related to Czerny, but since we have 4 great experts here, you can also ask them for anything else from their expertise.
And we'll try to find you in the light and dark. And also we have the online audience, so if anybody's monitoring the online audience and has any notes, we can also answer those queries.
I will ask ladies, you can have your seats.
Okay, yes, please do. I can probably do a bit of a running around with the microphone as necessary.
So we do not have any questions online yet, so let's give a chance to our audience here.
And I get the point that we are standing between you and some refreshments, so that's always a difficult call. But still trying to note if anybody is particularly intrigued, has doubts, ideas, thoughts, challenges.
Yeah, first question.
So thank you so much for the team which is behind this amazing event. And I have just a question. In the entrance, there are some ostrakas and drawing, I think by Czerny. It's not a big collection. I think there are 3 pieces of ostrakas. And I just want to know some more about what is the collection available in Egypt. We know about the collection available in Oxford for the work. And the other thing, there was thing about that how Czerny was buying from his savings, ostrakas, collecting material. Sure, some of the content I think was from museums, British Museum, and also, but like the ostrakas, like someone was saying, I think in the conference, that he was from his savings buying ostrakas. So what is the process of, if anyone knows, the process of collecting ostrakas and translating the text? This is interesting. If it's known, how was the process of doing that? Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think we'll probably have everyone a little bit to say about it. In general terms, ostraka were coming out of the excavations. Czerny and also other people in his time, from František Lexa in Prague to Jean Capart in Belgium, were noticing the importance of these pieces. Many Egyptologists were. And Czerny realized that ostraka were traveling from Egypt, being bought by art dealers. Very often the context was lost. So he was among people discussing some kind of coordination of mapping ostraka that are in the world, that were in the world collections already in the 1930s. And there was an idea in 1931 that he was discussing with Jean Capart. And that was particularly to make some sort of a research hub in Brussels for ostraka research, where people would put in information about ostraka from all the collections in Cairo, in Turin, in the British Museum, and also private collections, because private collections were another source. When he was buying ostraka, it was from art dealers in Luxor, very often in the hope that he will prevent these ostraka from disappearing in hands of somebody who will just admire them at home without giving the opportunity for a scientific study. So ostraka were becoming part of popular objects to be collected in his time, and he and his colleagues noticed that there has to be some way of mapping this body of material. When it comes to accessibility, I think in the archive material there is actually plenty that people can consult.
So the whole catalog is available online, so you can scroll through all the manuscript groups. You find detailed descriptions there, information about when everything was accessed. At the moment, not everything, unfortunately, is digitized, but we're planning on digitizing as much as possible. You can imagine that is a rather large project, and there are always financial restrictions. So we are looking for funding. This cannot just be paid out of our normal budget, so to speak. So everyone who is aware of any funding opportunities or wants to contribute themselves, please feel free to approach me later. But yeah, we try every day, schweyer, to digitize more and more of our archive.
And with regards to the objects in the entrance hall, you can of course consult the ostraka catalog published at the website of the French Institute, so you can make a note of the specific number, and you can find their photos and further information where it was published, in which volume, and you can also download the photos, for example. And with an appointment with Cédric Lachet, it's also possible to see these pieces stored here in the archives. For a study or further information. And the same is true for the archival documents you see in the showcase, like the letters and other materials, as Hana used, for example, for writing the biography.
Okay, thank you. I only have a comment. Thank you, Hana, and for the other speakers. Because I always asking myself about the achievement of Czerny, because if looking at his full publication, it's amazing, and it's a gigantic work. And I always wondering how he find the time to write all these publications. And at one time, I asked Rob de Marais, he's also a pioneer in hieratic. I asked Rob, do you think how he can, can anyone find the time to write only one or two of these publications? Because I always working and looking and searching in the box of Czerny, and for myself, if I just wrote 2 books, I think I already made an achievement. So he has field activities, and he has a teaching, and he has just a comment, because it's really difficult for a human being to write all these publications. It's just a comment. So thank you for make Czerny closer to us. Thank you.
Yeah, but please, yeah, you can. Yeah.
Well, I think that it was more possible in his days because there was no television, no bothering by telephone to everybody every 5 minutes and being interrupted and this and that. So, plus, of course, he was impressing people, so nobody would dare to disturb him when he was working. So I think that helps. Today, we have just the opposite. All the environment which prevents us from working rather than encourage us to work.
Thank you. I think that is a very, very good comment about his work ethics, because it was quite remarkable. And for Professor Fayza, you knew him as a person. So you knew him as a very friendly person too. So he was the opposite of some sort of closeted scholar.
No, well, he was very friendly indeed. But I mean, he was impressive also. Huh? So people did not dare to disturb him all the time. But I mean, just looking at him working, every day, I remember every day he would open the door, make sure that I was in the library, say good morning and go away. He just want to check that I was there, you know. So, and because there was not so many undergraduates in those days, I used to attend his discussions with other colleagues. For example, Sarah Grohl came for a very long time to work with him to get the New Egyptian dictionary, New Egyptian grammar. And in order to benefit from their discussion, you would go there. Of course, I was still a young student, but I think listening to scholars discussing is very enriching. You can learn a lot by just attending, and they were very nice. I mean, they never told me not to come. That was Czerny, you know, to anybody who wants to learn is welcome. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's also the non-gatekeeper, the open person. But I spotted a question in the public.
Yeah, thank you so much for this interesting lecture and talk. If I got it correctly, you have mentioned that Professor Czerny, did some work on tennis. If it's correct, could you tell us more about this?
I'm not entirely sure tennis was... I mean, he was aware of the ongoing work, especially of Piemonte during the war. So he was certainly paying attention. But he was not himself actively involved. He was involved in a number of sites, but interestingly, it was sort of mostly or almost exclusively from pyramid fields up. So he was an Upper Egyptian person very much. Am I mistaken? Have I forgotten?
I think maybe you mentioned Tanis because I mentioned it in my lecture that there are records in our archive which also relate to work on, for instance, objects from Tanis. Maybe that's why the question came up. But no, he never actively himself excavated in Tanis.
Thank you.
One thing which was special with Czerny was also the variegated interest he had. But when I went to be his student, first he was very astonished that I was a woman, because in those days they did not expect young women to travel. But then I said I wanted to work on religion. He said, I'm not interested. I So I said, but you wrote a book on religion. He said that when I was younger and just beginning to write books, but now I'm not very much interested. However, if you are, go ahead, go to the British Museum and ask for such and such a papyra, and that can be very good for you for a PhD thesis. So this is what I did. So he would direct you, but leave you free at the same time. So I think this is something, a good lesson for us who want to impose our ideas to our students. So.
Looking for more questions?
Yes, thank you all for this magnificent view into the life of Černý. I was wondering, could you say a little bit more about his time as a diplomat during the war? How, you know, what were his activities here? How did this work? Was he based here full time at the time, or how was this part of his career shaped?
Thank you for that question. It was, as His Excellency Ambassador Haykal mentioned at the beginning, Černý was able to move between different spheres. Of course, he did his first stint in informal diplomacy, in soft power, if you want, when he was here, 1925, because that was also a kind of a presentation of Czechoslovakia as a friend of France, and the Czechoslovak-French connection was cultivated very actively. So Černý was sort of introduced into the world of intercultural contact and diplomacy. On the other hand, the wartime was very different. He was in Cairo. He escaped by sheer luck. He traveled to Egypt days before the Nazi armies invaded Czechoslovakia in March 1939. So that was pure luck that he was in Egypt. He stayed in Egypt with a full knowledge that his brother and his mother were trapped in Czechoslovakia, and he had no way of helping them. However, he wanted to be involved in the resistance in some way. His French friends in France were involved in the resistance very soon, when that became a fact of life in the divided France during the war. And Černý then applied to become part of the Czechoslovak military in exile. He wasn't accepted because of his myopia, same problem. So he wanted to find some outlet for that kind of activity, and he was offered the work at the Czechoslovak legation, residing in a villa a couple of hundreds of meters from here in Hasrelajny. The building, I'm told, is still there. And that was his base. He was living here at the Ifao, but he was working with the Czechoslovak legation, preparing broadcasts that were then broadcasted to the occupied Czech and Moravian lands during the war. And then he was transferred to London in 1943 and continued his, essentially, if you want, a role of a propagandist. So he was in the diplomatic service, and he was the person writing and also reading and preparing the broadcasts to support the morale in occupied Czechoslovakia. So it was quite a specific activity as a diplomat. But he was on the diplomatic list, and he was moving in the diplomatic circles. In that sense, he was very much part of the war effort. So those were his wartime experiences here. It was not an easy time for him, but he did manage to deliver that part of his job. And at that same time, he was also visiting the pyramid fields, including Abu Sir, and documenting inscriptions there, which then later had the fortuitous good sort of repercussion in enabling the Czechoslovak Institute to settle in Abu Sir. Any comments or additions? We're covered. Any other questions?
I just want to say how friendly Czerny was, because when he came to Egypt and I was there, he would always tell me, do you want me to tell something to your family? And he became friends with my family, you know? So I have photos of him in our garden or something like that. So he was always prepared to make links and to know people and to know them better. So, I mean, that was being his student was very enriching, not only academically, but also as a human being, you know. You want to?
Any further questions?
I thought I spotted a hand, but it might have been trick of light. Also, do we have anything from the online audience at the moment? Not yet. Okay.
Thank you. I'd like firstly to express my gratitude to all of the speakers today, Professor Haykal, Professor Gabler, Professor Rosenow, and Professor Navrátilová. Thank you very much for enriching us with such magnificent information on the personal life of Jaroslav Černý, a figure who we used to look at as kind of conceptualized researcher, like we very rarely thought of him as a person, but a scholar. In your talk, Professor Rosenow, you briefly mentioned a newly launched database, Gazetteer, and you pointed to Dr. Navrátilová, yes, as you do right now. I would wonder if you would care to expand on this a little bit more and inform us about this newly published database.
It is very much a collaborative effort, actually, and it is a collection, it's a growing collection that should present the Egyptian graffiti. As you know, graffiti or dipinti are inscriptions added to so many surfaces in Egypt. It's a complete legacy of the ancient civilization that is outside of the scope of monumental inscriptions. And Černý was one of the people who were actively pursuing the research of graffiti. Actually, when he started in Deir el-Medina in 1925, that was one of his goals, to map the graffiti, and he then finalized this project when the Graffiti de la Montagne Thébaine was launched in the 1960s. So it was very much in the context of his legacy that among several people working on graffiti, we conceptualized the database, the Graffiti Gazetteer. It's a growing project. It's a sort of like a beta or demo version, if you want. But we managed to get a first batch of the Griffith Institute archive records of graffiti online. They are from Saqqara. They're not directly from Černý. They were consulted with Černý, but made by Betiscom Gan, who was his predecessor as a professor in Oxford and also a friend of his. And the next batch, hopefully coming thanks to the support of the American Research Center in Egypt, is the Dipinti from Medoum, also from the archives of Betiscom Gan, also with comments from Černý. So that's the connection. It's a growing project, and we are also looking for developments and collaborations in there, but that's the link to the Černý work.
Thank you. And anyone else would like to comment or raise any question? All right.
I think we've probably exhausted everybody. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here. And once again, even though our hosts are already kept busy by other duties, once again, big thanks to the Embassy of the Czech Republic in Egypt and also the French Institute of Oriental Archaeology. It's a great honor to be here, also a great honor to be here with all of you. Thanks for wonderful questions, and to my friends and colleagues in the panel and mentors also, because Professor Fayza Haykal is in many ways our link in the sort of Egyptological network that goes beyond the present. So big thanks to everybody, and also, last but not least, to Lucy, who has been our guide through this evening. Thank you.
And So last words for me, I would like to thank our panelists who were amazing, and I thank them for enriching us with many, many information and from their expertise. So thank you so much, ladies, for being here with us tonight. And my very last word is that I would like to invite you all to stay with us here in the garden, enjoy a little bit of informal networking and some refreshments which are now ready for you. So please do not leave yet and enjoy your night. Thank you.
You will not be able to give anything because you have your phone.